The camera lingers on a dimly lit room. The walls are lined with photographs, frozen moments of a man who once defined charm, elegance, and Hollywood allure. Richard Gere's face stares back at us from every angle. The suave young officer in An Officer and a Gentleman, the irresistible millionaire in Pretty Woman, the award-winning actor in Chicago. For decades, his very presence was enough to light up a theater, to make millions believe in love, in passion, in the fantasy of cinema. But today, at 75, the story behind those pictures is no longer one of triumph. It is one of quiet sorrow, of tragedy wrapped in silence. Few actors have embodied the romantic dream as Richard Gere did. In the 1980s and 1990s, he was the man every woman wanted and every man envied. His smile could sell a movie. His eyes could break a heart. He wasn't just an actor, he was a cultural phenomenon, the definition of leading man. And yet, even as Hollywood adored him, Richard Gere carried burdens invisible to the public eye. Behind the elegance, there were cracks that widened with time, until the man once considered untouchable was left struggling with the very things he once seemed immune to: fading fame, fractured love, and the creeping weight of age. Richard Gere's life is a paradox. On the one hand, he lived the dream: wealth, success, global recognition, romances that filled tabloids. On the other hand, he bore the curse of fame, the scrutiny of the press, the collapse of his marriages, the whispers about his health, the silence of casting calls that grew fewer with each passing year. For a man who once had the world at his feet, the fall has been brutal, so brutal that it forces us to ask whether Hollywood ever truly loves its stars, or whether it merely uses them until they are no longer useful. At 75, Gere's tragedy is not a sudden disaster, but a slow erosion, a life that looks perfect from afar, but reveals deep loneliness up close. His story is not about scandalous downfall or shocking headlines, but something even more heartbreaking: the quiet realization that time spares no one, not even those who once seemed eternal. The tragedy of Richard Gere is the tragedy of a man who gave everything to the screen, only to discover that the screen gives nothing back when the lights fade. To understand why Richard Gere's life today carries such weight, we must first look at the man he himself, not the icon, not the star, but the boy from Philadelphia, who dreamed of something greater. We must retrace his journey from humble beginnings to international stardom, to the choices that built his empire and the mistakes that dismantled it. We must uncover the loves that lifted him, the losses that broke him, and the quiet battles he continues to fight at an age when others fade quietly into obscurity. Gere never wanted obscurity. He wanted to matter. And perhaps that is the cruelest part of his tragedy. He still does, but in ways that no longer bring him joy. The hook of Richard Gere's life is not in the glamour, but in the shadows behind it. His marriages to Cindy Crawford, Carrie Lowell, and Alejandra Silva paint a portrait of a man searching desperately for lasting love, but finding only fleeting chapters. His career highs, Golden Globe wins, Oscar nominations, unforgettable roles were often followed by stretches of silence, where the roles he deserved went to younger men or to actors more willing to play Hollywood's political games. Gere's outspoken activism, particularly his defense of human rights and his criticism of China, cost him opportunities that other stars took for granted. Hollywood, once his kingdom, quietly began closing its doors. And when the applause faded, Gere was left with something far more haunting than scandal: invisibility. Invisibility is the enemy of every actor. For Gere, it is perhaps the deepest cut of all. To go from being the most desired man on screen to a name whispered only in the context of what once was, that is the kind of wound that no award, no fortune can heal. At 75, He battles not only with his own aging body, but with the cruel memory of a Time when he was worshipped. It is a burden heavy enough to crush anyone, but especially a man who was once larger than life. This is where our story begins, not in the glamour of Hollywood premieres, but in the quiet of a man reflecting on everything he has lost and everything he still clings to. Richard Gere's tragedy is not that he failed. It is that he succeeded beyond measure, only to discover that success is fleeting and that even legends are eventually forgotten. And so, we invite you to step behind the curtain, to walk through the golden years, the romantic triumphs, the whispered scandals, and the painful silence that followed. To see Richard Gere not as the untouchable star, but as a man flawed, fragile, and facing the one battle no one ever wins: Time. Because sometimes the most heartbreaking tragedies are not those that explode in the public eye, but the ones that unfold slowly, quietly, in the spaces between applause. At 75, Richard Gere's story is exactly that. A tale beyond heartbreaking, a tragedy written not in scandal, but in silence. And it begins, as all great Hollywood stories do, with a man chasing a dream, only to find that the dream comes at a cost. Long before the red carpets, flashing cameras, and romantic movie posters, Richard Tiffany Gere was just a boy growing up in the quiet suburbs of Syracuse, New York. Born on August 31, 1949, into a middle-class family, he was not destined for Hollywood, at least not on paper. His father, Homer George Gere, worked as an insurance agent, while his mother, Doris Ann, devoted herself to raising their children. The household was modest, rooted in discipline and values, rather than glamour or wealth. But within young Richard, there was a restlessness, a hunger for something larger than the world he saw around Chaim. As a child, Richard was known for two things: his quiet sensitivity and his love of music. He was a shy boy, not the loud, charismatic type one might expect from a future star. Instead, he gravitated toward introspection, spending hours alone practicing the trumpet, an instrument that became his first true passion. Music was his escape, his way of dreaming beyond the streets of upstate New York. His teachers noted his talent, his focus, and the peculiar intensity with which he approached even the simplest tasks. That intensity, though unnoticed at the Time, would become the very foundation of his acting career. The Gere household instilled in Richard a deep sense of morality and social responsibility. His father was not only a provider, but also a man of community service, deeply engaged in local charities and humanitarian causes. These values would shape Richard for life. Unlike many of his Hollywood peers, who were often consumed by the pursuit of fame and excess, Gere carried with Chaim a sense of duty, an awareness that the world was bigger than himself. Yet, that same awareness also made Chaim restless. He wanted to leave Syracuse. He wanted to see what else life could offer. In high school, Richard was not the most popular student, but he was memorable. He excelled in gymnastics, developing both the discipline and physical grace that would later make him so magnetic on screen. At the same time, he became deeply involved in the arts, participating in music groups and small theatrical productions. These experiences gave him his first taste of performing for an audience, though even then, he could not have imagined that he would one day become one of the most recognizable faces in cinema. After graduating from high school, Gere earned a gymnastics scholarship to the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where he pursued philosophy as a major. Philosophy, more than anything else, revealed his intellectual curiosity. He was fascinated by the deeper questions of existence, the meaning of life, and the human condition questions that would later echo in the complex characters he chose to portray on screen. But despite his academic pursuits, Richard found he himself increasingly drawn back to the arts. Music remained a constant companion, and theater began to whisper to Chaim with a voice he could no longer ignore. It was during these years that Gere first confronted the possibility of becoming an artist. He was not the product of a Hollywood family. He had no connections, no mentors in the film industry. All he had was raw ambition, a willingness to take risks, and an almost spiritual belief that his life was meant for something more. That belief propelled Chaim to leave behind the stability of college life and step into the uncertain world of acting. It was a leap of faith, one that many in his family did not fully understand, but one that Richard knew he had to take. His earliest years as a performer were far from glamorous. Gere began in regional theater, working tirelessly in productions that paid little and demanded much. He spent countless nights rehearsing in cramped rooms, often doubting whether he had made the right decision. But with every performance, he sharpened his craft. He learned to command the stage, to use his body and his voice to tell stories that resonated with strangers. It was grueling work, but it was also transformative. The shy boy from Syracuse was slowly becoming a man who could hold an audience in the palm of his hand. During these formative years, Gere also discovered Buddhism, a philosophy that would later become central to his identity. The teachings of compassion, impermanence, and detachment spoke to Chaim in ways nothing else had. They provided Chaim with a framework to understand not only his place in the world, but also the fleeting nature of fame and success, an insight that would prove both a blessing and a curse in his later life. By the early 1970s, Richard Gere had built a reputation as a talented young actor on the stage. He landed roles in off-Broadway productions, where his combination of physical presence and emotional vulnerability set Chaim apart from his peers. Yet, even as he made progress, he was still a long way from Hollywood. The road ahead was uncertain, paved with rejection, struggle, and countless auditions. But Gere had something that many others lacked: perseverance. He had learned from his childhood that nothing was handed to you. You had to fight for it, believe in it, and endure the pain of failure until success finally came. Looking back, Gere's childhood and early years were not marked by privilege or scandal, but by discipline, art, and an insatiable hunger for meaning. They were the years that shaped Chaim into more than just another Hollywood star. They built the foundation for the man who would one day become a global icon. Yet, they also planted the seeds of the tragedy that would define his later years. The conflict between his spiritual longing for peace and the brutal demands of an industry that thrives on vanity and ambition. Richard Gere's story begins not with glamour, but with a boy in a quiet town searching for music, philosophy, and truth. It is in that search that we begin to understand the man behind the star, the man whose tragedy at 75 is not simply the loss of fame, but the eternal struggle to reconcile who he is with who the world wanted him to be. The 1970s were a time of transformation in Hollywood. Old traditions were collapsing, and a new wave of actors edgier, grittier, and more rebellious was emerging. It was in this climate that Richard Gere found his way into the spotlight. Having cut his teeth on stage, Gere approached acting with a seriousness and discipline that many found rare. He was not content to simply memorize lines and recite them. He wanted to inhabit the soul of every character, to turn each performance into a revelation of human fragility. His first significant break came through theater, not film. Gere began performing in various off-Broadway productions, including a 1973 revival of the musical Grease, in which he played the role of Danny Zuko. Unlike the slick, clean-cut versions of the role that would later become iconic with John Travolta, Gere brought a raw, edgy quality. He wasn't just performing, he was commanding attention. Critics noticed, and soon his stage work began to translate into small but meaningful opportunities in film and television. Richard Gere's film career started modestly, with supporting roles that allowed him to demonstrate his magnetism without fully carrying a project. But even in small roles, his presence was undeniable. Casting directors began to see what audiences on Broadway already knew. This young actor had something different. He wasn't the typical Hollywood pretty boy, nor was he the method-obsessed outsider. He was both. A man of striking looks and smoldering charisma, but also an actor with intensity and depth. His breakthrough moment arrived in 1977 with Looking for Mr. Goodbar, where he played a dangerous and seductive drifter opposite Diane Keaton. Though not the leading man, Gere's performance was electrifying, unpredictable, dangerous, and magnetic. Audiences couldn't take their eyes off him. Suddenly, the industry realized that Richard Gere wasn't just another supporting player. He was a star in the making. But it was his role in American Gigolo, 1980, that transformed Chaim from an up-and-comer into a cultural phenomenon. Directed by Paul Schrader, the film cast Gere as Julian Kay, a high-priced male escort navigating a world of wealth, lust, and moral emptiness. It was a role no other major actor dared to touch, one that required not only physical beauty, but also the ability to convey loneliness, vulnerability, and existential despair. Gere embraced it fearlessly. His lean frame, stylish suits, and hauntingly distant gaze became the image of early 1980s sophistication. American Gigolo was more than a film. It was a statement, and Richard Gere was its centerpiece. The movie catapulted Chaim into superstardom. Suddenly, Gere was on the cover of magazines, hailed as the sex symbol of a generation. His name became synonymous with elegance and danger. Armani, the Italian fashion house, even credited American Gigolo with putting their brand on the global map, thanks to Gere's unforgettable wardrobe in the film. Overnight, he wasn't just an actor, he was an icon. But the rise did not stop there. In 1982, Gere delivered another unforgettable performance in An Officer and a Gentleman. Playing Zach Mayo, a troubled military trainee who finds both discipline and love, Gere gave audiences something they had never seen from him before. A mixture of toughness and tenderness, arrogance and vulnerability. The film's climax, where Gere's character, in crisp white uniform, carries Deborah Winger's character out of her factory job, became one of the most iconic romantic images in film history. That single scene cemented his status not just as a star, but as the romantic leading man of his era. By the mid-1980s, Gere was unstoppable. He had the looks, the talent, and the cultural momentum. Hollywood saw Chaim as the perfect blend of Brando's intensity and Newman's charm. Yet, beneath the surface, there was unease. Gere himself was skeptical of fame, wary of the industry's obsession with image over substance. He longed to play characters of complexity, to pursue stories that mattered. But Hollywood wanted him to be the eternal lover, the charming rogue, the man whose beauty could sell tickets. This tension between his artistic hunger and Hollywood's demands would haunt Chaim for decades. The rise also came with temptations and distractions. Gere was suddenly surrounded by the excesses of celebrity-lavish parties, endless attention, and the pressure of maintaining an image. The tabloids became obsessed with his personal life, linking him to high-profile romances, most famously with model Cindy Crawford. While their relationship made headlines, it also trapped Gere in a spotlight that often felt suffocating. He was admired, even worshipped, but rarely understood. Still, throughout the 1980s and into the early 1990s, Gere rode the wave of superstardom. He followed his blockbuster hits with films that showcased both his charisma and his range. In Pretty Woman, 1990, opposite Julia Roberts, Gere once again became the embodiment of romance. As Edward Lewis, the wealthy businessman who falls in love with a prostitute, Gere crafted one of the most beloved love stories in modern cinema. The film was a massive success, and its fairy tale ending only further cemented his reputation as Hollywood's ultimate leading man. Yet, the seeds of tragedy were already being sown. For while Richard Gere's rise seemed meteoric, it was also fragile. Hollywood has a cruel way of turning yesterday's icons into today's forgotten names. Gere's activism, his refusal to play by Hollywood's political rules, and his constant yearning for roles of depth rather than superficiality, began to put him at odds with the industry. What had made him magnetic as a young actor, his refusal to conform, would ironically make him vulnerable as he aged. Looking back, the rise of Richard Gere was dazzling. From a shy boy in Syracuse to one of the most desired men on earth, his journey reads like a Hollywood script. But, unlike the fairy tales he so often portrayed on screen, Gere's real-life story would not remain wrapped in happy endings. His rise was extraordinary, but it set the stage for an equally dramatic fall, one that would prove far more heartbreaking than any role he ever played. By the early 1990s, Richard Gere was not merely an actor. He was the embodiment of Hollywood romance. If the 1980s had made him a star, the next decade crowned him as a global icon. His face was plastered on billboards, his movies drew millions, and his reputation as the ultimate leading man seemed unshakable. For a teammate, it looked as though Richard Gere had achieved the impossible. He was both critically respected and adored by mainstream audiences. The turning point, of course, was Pretty Woman in 1990. Paired with a then-unknown Julia Roberts, Gere transformed a film that many thought would be a small, quirky romantic comedy into a cultural juggernaut. As Edward Lewis, the wealthy but emotionally closed-off businessman who finds love in the most unlikely of places, Gere delivered a performance of remarkable restraint and subtlety. Where other actors might have leaned into arrogance, Gere chose to play Edward with quiet melancholy, a man desperate for connection beneath the polished surface. The chemistry with Roberts was electric, and the film became one of the highest-grossing romantic comedies of all time. Overnight, Gere wasn't just famous, he was immortalized. The film also crystallized his image in the public imagination. He became the man every woman dreamed of being swept away by, the man who could walk into a room and instantly command attention. But with that image came limitations. Hollywood is notorious for pigeonholing its stars, and soon Gere found himself typecast as the charming, older romantic. It was a role he excelled at, but one that increasingly boxed him in. Still, the 1990s were undeniably his golden era. He starred in Internal Affairs, 1990, a crime thriller where he played a corrupt cop, a role that allowed him to flex his darker side. His performance was chilling, proving that he was more than just a romantic hero. Then came Sommersby, 1993, Primal Fear, 1996, and Runaway Bride, 1999, each film reinforcing his status as one of Hollywood's most bankable stars. In Primal Fear, opposite a young Edward Norton, Gere's portrayal of a high-powered defense attorney earned him widespread critical acclaim, showing once again that he could carry complex roles beyond the romantic genre. At the peak of his fame, Gere also became one of Hollywood's most photographed men. His marriage to supermodel Cindy Crawford turned him into half of the decade's most glamorous couple. They were seen as the ultimate Hollywood pairing: beauty, fame, wealth, and influence wrapped into one. Magazines couldn't get enough of them, and for a while, they represented everything dazzling about celebrity culture. But behind the polished smiles and glossy photo spreads, the relationship was turbulent. The age difference, the constant scrutiny, and the pressures of fame eventually led to divorce in 1995. The split became tabloid fodder, with speculation swirling endlessly about why one of the most beautiful couples in the world couldn't make it work. Even amid personal turmoil, Gere continued to command the screen. In 2002, he starred in Chicago, a film adaptation of the Broadway musical. As Billy Flynn, the slick lawyer with a silver tongue and endless charm, Gere delivered a show-stopping performance that reminded audiences of his versatility. He sang, he danced, he dazzled. The film went on to win the Academy Award for Best Picture, and Gere himself took home a Golden Globe. It should have marked the beginning of a new chapter, a resurgence in his career. Instead, it became one of his last great triumphs before Hollywood began to quietly turn its back on him. At his peak, Gere's fame was intoxicating, but also precarious. Unlike some of his peers who cultivated a safe, apolitical persona, Gere was outspoken. He used his platform to advocate for human rights, particularly in Tibet, where he openly criticized the Chinese government. His activism won him respect from many, but also made him a target of controversy. Hollywood, heavily invested in the Chinese market, began to see Gere as a liability. Studios that once courted him for leading roles suddenly grew hesitant. His career, which had once seemed indestructible, was now vulnerable to forces beyond his control. But in the 1990s and early 2000s, audiences didn't see the cracks. They saw only the man who could carry Julia Roberts into the sunset, who could hold a courtroom spellbound, who could glide across a dance floor in Shall We Dance, 2004. He was still the face of romance, still the icon of charm, still the actor who could turn even the simplest love story into something timeless. The tragedy was not yet visible, but it was coming. The fame came with other costs as well. Gere often spoke about the isolating nature of celebrity, about the difficulty of distinguishing genuine relationships from those built on image or opportunity. For all the adoration he received, he struggled with deep loneliness. Hollywood had given him everything: money, fame, adoration, but it had also taken away his privacy, his peace, and, eventually, his sense of belonging. In many ways, Gere's peak was both dazzling and deceptive. He was at the center of the world stage, but beneath the glamour was a man who felt increasingly trapped by the very image that made him famous. His career was soaring, but his personal life was fractured. His activism gave him purpose, but it also planted the seeds of professional exile. It was the height of his success, but also the beginning of his downfall. The tragedy of Richard Gere is that his fame, as glorious as it was, carried within it the blueprint for his decline, the very qualities that made him a legend. His looks, his charm, his refusal to conform would, in TMA, become the reasons Hollywood turned away. At 75, when he looks back on these years, he must see them as both the pinnacle of his dreams and the cruel reminder of how fleeting such dreams can be. The fall of a Hollywood star is rarely sudden. It comes in whispers, in missed opportunities, in headlines that shift from adoration to speculation. For Richard Gere, the decline was subtle at first. In the 1980s and 1990s, he was untouchable. But, as the years passed, as new stars emerged, and the industry's appetite for youth grew insatiable, the cracks in his carefully constructed image began to show. By the 2000s, the man once hailed as the quintessential leading man of Hollywood found himself standing at the edges of the stage, watching others take the spotlight. One of the most damaging elements to Gere's career was the very thing that made him different: his refusal to play Hollywood's game. Gere was not interested in chasing blockbuster franchises or compromising his principles for the sake of box office success. He was outspoken about his beliefs, particularly his advocacy for Tibet and his criticism of the Chinese government. What began as noble activism slowly turned into a professional liability. By the mid-2000s, Hollywood studios hungry for access to the Chinese market considered Gere's presence in a film a risk. Roles that once would have been his went to younger, safer, less controversial actors. The press framed it as a quiet blacklisting. Gere himself later admitted in interviews that he was no longer offered the kind of projects he once commanded. "There are definitely movies that I can't be in because the Chinese will say, 'Not with Hayim,'" he confessed. For an actor who had spent decades at the center of Hollywood's universe, this sudden marginalization was not just a career setback. It was a devastating reminder of how quickly power shifts in an industry built on profit and politics. At the same time, Gere's personal life fed the tabloids with stories that often overshadowed his work. His high-profile divorce from Cindy Crawford in 1995 had already left scars. But subsequent relationships, including his marriage to Carrie Lowell, became fodder for gossip magazines. Their divorce in 2016 was particularly brutal, involving a drawn-out legal battle over Gere's estimated $250 million fortune. The proceedings dragged his private struggles into the public eye, painting a picture of a man whose romantic life, once idealized in films, was, in reality, tumultuous and deeply painful. Then there were the scandals, most notably the infamous gerbil rumor. Though entirely baseless, the urban legend that spread in the 1990s became one of the most persistent and damaging myths attached to Gere's name. He denied it repeatedly, and no evidence ever supported it. Yet the story refused to die. It became a cruel punchline in late-night comedy routines and a shadow that followed Hayim wherever he went. For a man who had built his career on elegance and dignity, being reduced to the subject of a crude, false rumor was humiliating. It exemplified the dark side of fame. Once the public latches onto a narrative, no matter how absurd, it can become inseparable from reality. Career-wise, Gere tried to reinvent himself. He took roles in smaller, independent films, hoping to find artistic fulfillment outside the constraints of Hollywood blockbusters. Movies like Arbitrage, 2012, and Time Out of Mind, 2014, earned him critical praise, with some reviewers calling his performances among the best of his career. But these films, while admired, reached only niche audiences. The mass adoration, the cultural dominance he once enjoyed, was gone. For Gere, it must have felt like screaming into the void, still talented, still capable, yet largely ignored by the very industry that once celebrated Hayim. The tragedy deepened as the roles dried up. While his peers actors like Harrison Ford, Tom Hanks, and Denzel Washington continued to headline major films, Gere became increasingly absent from mainstream cinema. The man who once carried entire box office hits could now barely find a place in Hollywood at all. To fans, his absence was confusing. To Gere, it was heartbreaking. He had not lost his ability. He had lost Hollywood's favor. Meanwhile, age added another layer of cruelty. Gere had built his image on youth, charm, and sexuality. As he entered his 60s and 70s, that image became harder to maintain. Hollywood, unforgiving as always, turned to younger faces to play the roles Gere had once dominated. He was no longer the man who could sweep Julia Roberts off her feet or command a courtroom with charisma. He was aging, and in Hollywood, aging is often treated as a sin. His activism, though noble, only widened the gap. Gere devoted himself to humanitarian causes, working tirelessly for human rights, AIDS awareness, and Tibetan independence. He became a respected figure outside of Hollywood, admired for his commitment to global justice. Yet, paradoxically, the more he pursued his true calling, the further he drifted from the industry that had made him famous. His spiritual journey, rooted in Buddhism, gave him personal peace, but also alienated him from a Hollywood machine that values marketability over morality. In interviews, Gere has spoken candidly about the loneliness of this stage in his life. Fame, once intoxicating, had become isolating. Friends drifted away, offers disappeared, and the applause that had once followed him everywhere grew faint. For a man who had defined romance and charisma for an entire generation, this slow descent into obscurity was a kind of living tragedy. Not a scandal, not a spectacular fall, but a quiet fading, a reminder that even legends are not immune to time, politics, and public forgetfulness. The heartbreak of Richard Gere's decline is not that he lost everything. It is that he lost the one thing he cherished most: relevance. For decades, his work mattered. His name carried weight. Now, at 75, he is left to grapple with the silence, to wonder how a man who once had it all could be pushed so far to the margins. The boy from Syracuse, who dreamed of greatness, achieved it, but only to discover that greatness in Hollywood is always temporary. The twilight years of a star's life often reveal the harshest truths, and for Richard Gere, the years after his peak have been defined by contradictions. Moments of personal joy intertwined with deep battles against time, health, and an industry that has largely turned its back on him. At 75, Gere's life is a portrait of resilience, but also of heartbreak. After his divorce from Carrie Lowell in 2016, which left him both emotionally wounded and financially scarred, Gere seemed to retreat further from the public eye. The man who once strode confidently down red carpets began to appear less frequently, his roles fewer and further between. Yet in 2018, a surprising chapter began when Gere married Alejandra Silva, a Spanish publicist and activist nearly 34 years his junior. To outsiders, it seemed almost surreal. Hollywood's aging icon finding love once again in the arms of a much younger woman. Critics accused him of clinging to youth, while others saw it as a genuine search for peace and companionship. The marriage brought Gere a sense of renewal. With Silva, he became a father again in his 70s, welcoming 2 sons into the world. For many, this was a shocking twist. Richard Gere, the eternal bachelor romantic, starting a family at an age when most men are preparing for retirement. He often spoke about the joy of late fatherhood, describing it as a gift, a second chance to experience innocence and love. Yet beneath the smiles and photographs of him cradling his young children, there was also the shadow of time. Gere knew, perhaps more than anyone, that his years were limited, that he would not be there to see his sons grow old. The happiness of family life was tempered by the haunting knowledge of mortality. Health became another battle. Though Gere has always maintained a disciplined lifestyle embracing Buddhism, vegetarianism, and meditation, age spares no one. Reports emerged of hospital visits, of health scares kept largely private. Unlike some stars who openly confront illness in the public eye, Gere remained silent, choosing instead to guard his vulnerabilities. But the whispers of declining health only added to the sense of tragedy. For a man whose very image once embodied vitality, the reality of frailty was devastating. Professionally, Gere's later years were marked by exile. Hollywood, increasingly dependent on the Chinese box office, continued to distance itself from him due to his outspoken activism. He admitted in interviews that he had been shut out. "I'm not interested in playing the game anymore. I already played it." Instead, he turned to independent cinema, starring in films like Arbitrage, 2012, where he played a morally corrupt hedge fund magnate, and Time Out of Mind, 2014, a haunting portrayal of homelessness in New York City. Both performances were hailed as some of the finest of his career. yet they reached only a fraction of the audience his earlier work had commanded. The irony was bitter. Gere was delivering some of his deepest, most nuanced performances at a time when the world had stopped watching. This invisibility weighed heavily. For decades, Richard Gere had been a cultural fixture, his every move chronicled by paparazzi, his films dominating theaters worldwide. Now, he was often absent from conversations about Hollywood, overshadowed by newer stars and bigger franchises. For an actor who once defined an era, the silence was deafening. The tragedy was not that Gere had lost his talent, he hadn't, but that the industry no longer had room for him. In his private life, Gere sought refuge in spirituality. Buddhism, which had been a guiding force since his youth, became even more central. He retreated to meditation, to charitable work, to his advocacy for Tibet and human rights. These pursuits gave him purpose, but they also deepened the gulf between he himself and the Hollywood machine. To Gere, the search for compassion and meaning was essential. To the industry, it was irrelevant. His choice to prioritize inner peace over box office success made him admirable to some, but expendable to others. The loneliness of aging in the public eye is another battle Gere has faced. While he is not destitute or forgotten, his wealth and legacy are secure. The emotional toll of watching his stardom has been profound. For a man whose very identity was tied to being desired, adored, and remembered, the realization that he is no longer at the center of the cultural conversation is heartbreaking. Fame, once intoxicating, has become a ghost that haunts him, reminding him of what was and what will never return. Yet even in his later years, Gere has moments of quiet triumph. His devotion to humanitarian causes has earned him respect outside of Hollywood. His family life, however unconventional, has brought him joy. And his independent films, though underseen, have proven that his artistry has not faded. Still, the overarching narrative of his later years is one of exile, of a man who gave his life to an industry that eventually turned away. At 75, Richard Gere embodies the cruel paradox of stardom. To rise so high that the fall, when it comes, feels not like a stumble but like an erasure. His tragedy is not a single scandal or downfall, but the slow realization that the world has moved on without him. He is still here, still talented, still wise, still searching, but the applause has faded, the lights have dimmed, and the stage has grown quiet. In the end, Richard Gere's later years are both inspiring and heartbreaking. Inspiring, because he has refused to surrender his values, his spirituality, or his quest for meaning. Heartbreaking, because the cost of those choices has been invisibility, exile, and a sense of being forgotten by the very world he once defined. It is the cruel truth of Hollywood. The higher you rise, the harder the silence when the curtain finally falls. The story of Richard Gere is not only about rise and fall, it is about the haunting silence that lingers when the applause stops. At 75, his legacy stands at a strange crossroads, one that is both undeniable and uncertain. He is celebrated as one of Hollywood's most iconic leading men, yet his absence from mainstream cinema in the last 2 decades raises questions. How will history remember him? As the suave romantic who defined a generation? As the activist who sacrificed his career for his principles? Or as a star who was quietly erased by an industry that no longer found him useful? For millions of fans, Richard Gere will always be Edward Lewis, Zach Mayo, or Billy Flynn, the elegant dreamer, the tough officer, the slick lawyer. His films continue to play on television, reminding audiences of the magnetic force he once was. Younger generations still discover Pretty Woman and are captivated by his restrained charm. In this sense, Gere's immortality is secure. Cinema has preserved him in his prime, a man frozen in time, forever handsome, forever romantic. And yet, the real Richard Gere, the man who walks through life today, is a far more complicated figure. His activism remains central to his identity. Gear's work for Tibet, his commitment to Buddhism, his humanitarian efforts in health and poverty, these are not mere side notes, but defining aspects of his character. Few Hollywood stars have risked as much for their beliefs. In an age where most celebrities tread carefully to avoid controversy, Gear stood firm. He spoke out when others remained silent, knowing full well the cost. That cost was his career, but the reward was integrity. To his supporters, that integrity elevates Hayam beyond the trappings of fame. To his critics, it represents stubbornness, a refusal to adapt. The unanswered question is whether Hollywood will ever forgive Hayam. The industry is fickle, but it also loves a comeback. Gear has shown in films like Arbitrage that he still possesses the gravitas to lead a powerful story. Could there be a final act for Hayam? A role that brings Hayam back to the center of cinema? That reintroduces Hayam to the world as more than a relic of the past? Or has Time passed too far, leaving Hayam to remain in the shadows of what once was? His personal life also complicates his legacy. His late fatherhood and marriage to Alejandra Silva sparked debate about love, age, and mortality. To some, it seemed like a desperate attempt to cling to youth. To others, it was proof that love can bloom at any age, that joy can be found even in the twilight of life. These choices, like so many in Gear's life, resist simple interpretation. They are both inspiring and controversial, both romantic and tragic. The legacy of Richard Gere, then, is not just about what he did on screen, but how he lived off it, how he insisted on following his own path, no matter how misunderstood it made him. For the man himself, legacy may not matter as much as peace. Gere has often spoken about impermanence, about the fleeting nature of all things. His Buddhist faith teaches that fame, wealth, and even memory are illusions, destined to fade. Perhaps that is why, despite the heartbreak of being forgotten by Hollywood, Gere continues to live quietly, raising his children, practicing compassion, seeking meaning beyond the spotlight. In a way, he has already let go of the world that once adored Hayam. The tragedy is not that he has lost it. The tragedy is that the world seems unable to let go of the image it created, clinging to the star while ignoring the man. Still, there is something undeniably heartbreaking about watching a legend slip into obscurity. Richard Gere gave so much to cinema, and yet, at 75, he feels like a ghost in the industry he helped shape. His peers are celebrated, their careers extended by nostalgia and reinvention, while Gere remains quietly on the outside. Will future generations know him only as a name attached to old films, or will they understand the full depth of the man who sacrificed fame for values? The unanswered questions stretch further. What might Gere's career have looked like if he had chosen differently, if he had stayed silent on Tibet, if he had embraced franchises, if he had played Hollywood's political game? Would he still be at the center of the conversation? Or would he have lost himself entirely in the process? The tragedy of Richard Gere is not just what happened, but what might have been. And yet, his story also carries a warning. Hollywood is quick to idolize and quicker to discard. Gere's journey is a reminder of how fragile stardom truly is, how even the most celebrated faces can fade into the margins. For younger actors chasing fame, his life offers both inspiration and caution. Achieve greatness, yes, but never forget that greatness comes with a cost. At 75, Richard Gere stands as both legend and lesson. His legacy is undeniable, but his heartbreak is equally real. He will be remembered for his elegance, his performances, his charm. He will also be remembered for the silence that followed, for the battles he fought outside of the screen, for the way his principles cost Hayam the world he once ruled. And perhaps in the end, That is his true legacy. Not the roles he played, but the man he became when the cameras stopped rolling. The unanswered question remains, when Team A finally claims Richard Gere, how will the world speak of him? As the star who gave us fairy tale romances? As the activist who stood against the tide? Or as the forgotten man who slipped quietly away while others took the stage? The tragedy of Richard Gere is that the answer may never be singular. It may always be all of these things at once. For now, Richard Gere lives in the space between legend and obscurity, between memory and silence. At 75, his tragedy is beyond heartbreaking, not because he lost everything, but because he had everything and learned how fragile it truly was. His life, like the films he once defined, will forever remain a story of love, loss, beauty, and impermanence. And in that story lies both the pain and the poetry of Richard Gere.